Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
David sent me a note about a story involving the bureaucracy, following rules so closely, or at least they thought they were, that it becomes nonsensical. And this headline pretty much says it all. From Fox13News.com out of Florida, VA denies veterans claim, says heart attack is not an emergency. A heart attack is not an emergency. So apparently it's extremely important in this story whether a heart attack can be classified as an emergency or not. Now, most people say, yeah, a heart attack would be an emergency because you've heard these things such as like serious as a heart attack. And so it would seem to be quite serious and probably an emergency if you had one would think. So Craig Patrick wrote the story and says that 7 years after Congress passed a law reforming the Veterans Health Care Administration, the VA appears to have made a great deal of progress. The reforms, which increased the VA staff and allowed some veterans to receive private medical care, improved access to health care for many sick and wounded vets, but there are still some who are caught in a bind. In February, this man wasn't feeling right. He's a Vietnam-era Air Force veteran, and he couldn't say why, but he didn't feel right. So it was during the pandemic and at the height of mask wearing and social distancing, so everybody was either locked down or locked out. It's difficult to go anywhere. And he said that it actually made things difficult even dealing with the VA. And so he said if VA could not specifically define what was going on health-wise, they didn't want people in the facility. So as a backup for his VA health care, he has a Medicare Advantage plan, which he used to visit his cardiologist, who diagnosed him as having a heart attack. Now, this is a cardiologist. He would know, you'd think, right? So he says, this is the guy speaking, he's looking at me saying, you are having a heart attack right now. That's that's the quote. Just in case you're worried, maybe there's some ambiguity here. Was the concept really that spelled out? You are having a heart attack right now. And that's a cardiologist speaking to you, saying those words. So you would think that is serious and probably an emergency, right? So the next thing he remembers is waking up in the hospital. So his cardiologist says, you are having a heart attack, and boom, he checks out, like at least conscious-wise, right? So he's unconscious, and he wakes up in the hospital, which is, by the way, that's one of those things. Good news, bad news. Good news, you're still alive because you just woke up. Bad news, you're in the hospital. The doctors at that hospital installed 4 stents. 4 stents were installed, and they told him that they had to do that because he had a 98% blockage. So the heart attack was caused by a 98% blockage requiring the installation of 4 stents. Now, Medicare covered much of it, but the VA would not pick up the remainder of the tab. And you might say, but Steve, the VA's got rules. They got to follow rules. Well, we're getting there. The first bill that he was supposed to pay, because VA would not pick it up, was $600. Second one, $250. So we're out $850 here. He soon discovered he was caught in a quagmire over the definition of the word emergency. And of course, the policies that didn't match up to his situation, according to the VA. The VA denied his claim on grounds that what had happened to him, and this is the quote, does not meet a prudent layperson's definition of emergency. Number one, I'm not sure why you'd say a layperson's definition. It really ought to be more of a medical professional, because if a doctor says it's an emergency and the average person's like, I don't even know what that is, I'd go with the doctor. By the way, this was a major heart attack, and it happened in his doctor's office, during which he passed out. So they say that does not meet the definition of emergency. And he thought, well, I got something around that. His physician wrote a letter for him stating that what he'd had was an emergency. Now, call me crazy. If a doctor tells me something is a medical emergency, I tend to believe him. If a fireman tells me my house is burning, I tend to believe them, right? There's certain people that you trust because they're experts in their fields. And so if the doctor says, this is an emergency, you're having a heart attack, you're going to wake up in a hospital, hell, good, yeah, okay. The VA denial also stated that a VA facility was available. There was a VA facility available to provide the emergency services. And they also say didn't give them timely notification. Now, how timely of a notification can you give somebody when you are out in a hospital? The VA policy states that failure to report emergency care to the VA within 72 hours from the start of treatment may impact coverage. And coverage impact means they're not going to pay the bill. After passing out from a heart attack in his doctor's office, he didn't have a whole lot of say about where he wound up. He was unconscious at the time. He couldn't, by the way, sit up and go, hey guys, really quick, take me there but not there, and then pass out again because he was out. So he woke up in the hospital and he'd be there another 3 days for procedures and monitoring. And are you telling me that during everything they're doing to him, he's supposed to stop and raise his hand or something and say, excuse me, someone get me a phone. I need to notify the VA. I'm going to be on the phone probably for a few hours because they are going to put me on hold. So we need to be able to plug my phone in someplace or get me a landline. He says, I wasn't stabilized until I had 4 stents, and I still needed 2 more, so they kept me in until Monday when they did the last 2. So he wound up getting 6, apparently. VA policy does state that even if the notification did not occur timely, emergency treatment may still be eligible for reimbursement. The question, of course, is this an emergency? The man has a heart attack in his cardiologist's office and wakes up in the hospital. Is that an emergency? Now, I know, by the way, I've mentioned before, anytime I tell a story here, I'll get someone who's going to play devil's advocate. Someone is going to seriously, not as a joke, not as goofing around, someone's going to seriously comment and go, Steve, I understand this completely from the government's point of view. That's not an emergency. All he had was a heart attack in his cardiologist's office and passed out and woke up in a hospital. That's not an emergency. See, an emergency is, and I come up with some insane definition of emergency. Most people would consider it an emergency when it is life or death and you're in a position where your life rides entirely in the hands of others, meaning that he's out. He's out. So he can't direct his treatment. He can't tell them where to take him. He can't even help them at all. They can't ask him, by the way, how old are you? What blood type are you? He can't give, he's out. So he's laying on the floor, figuratively speaking, at his cardiologist's office. Well, let's assume he's on a table, okay? He's out. They got to call an ambulance for him. They got to get him to a hospital or he's going to die. Most people, I think, would consider that an emergency. But again, like I said, someone will argue with me. So there's a fight over whether or not they have to reimburse him in his case because it says they may still be eligible. So in 2019, a federal appeals court ruled that the VA has to reimburse victims for their emergency care outside the VA. But that was a class action that included veterans' claims from 2016 to future claims through 2025, pending further review that may or may not apply to this man who does live on a fixed income and cannot afford an $850 medical bill. It put me in a bind financially, he said, forcing him to cut back on essentials like food at a time when everything is getting more expensive. Meanwhile, Fox 13 reached out to the VA for comment on the man's case, but have yet to receive a response. I did a story a while back about a school that showed the movie Lion King as a fundraiser, and Disney contacted them, or whoever owns the rights to the movie, and said, you're not allowed to do that, you owe us money. And the amount of money they owed Disney wiped out the fundraiser. And I actually said at that time that if I was contacted by anybody from the school on their letterhead, I would pay that fine, and I did. I don't know if this man's gotten this $850 medical bill paid, but I know his name. It's in the story here. If he were to contact me or somebody contacted me on his behalf and I could confirm it, I'll pay the $850. I don't want this guy to be worrying about this. But I don't want that to interfere with the case of getting this matter straightened out for other people. So I hope they can get that straightened out. But as far as the $850 goes, I'd be happy to pay that on this man's behalf. So if you know the man, let him know that. If you know anybody at Fox 13 News, let him know that. But to me, that's a minor point. The bigger point here is that the VA has a great mission, taking care of our veterans' medical needs. Okay? That's a great, great concept. And I understand the government's got to have rules. But here's one where the rule actually says, if you have a medical emergency, we'll take care of you. But your heart attack in the cardiologist's office where you woke up in the hospital, it's not an emergency, is somebody horribly misinterpreting those rules. So I don't know what to say beyond that other than it's the government messing stuff up. So David, thanks for sending it. From Fox13News.com, Craig Patrick wrote that. VA denies veterans claim, says heart attack is not an emergency. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. I ordered a chicken and an egg from Amazon. I'll let you know.